Yeah. So, building on that, some sectors of the left have increasingly adopted multipolar frameworks where critique of the US empire leads to uncritical alignment with other state powers like China or Russia under the banner of anti-imperialism. At times, this seems to have been shaped by like a kind of Cold War nostalgia, a longing
Right.
for uh, a binary world where lines of solidarity and antagonism appeared clearer. Do you see this as another iteration of what you have called like solidarity as genre, where political clarity is claimed through like geopolitical
Mhm.
identification,
Right.
but contradiction and complicity remain unaddressed?
Right. I mean, we live in a unipolar world, right? So the US is now, sole arbiter of almost everybody's destinies by fiat. And
Yeah.
that does lead to maybe some positions and um, affiliations that, in the long light of day might seem questionable. But, it always
Mhm.
comes down to some very basic kinds of questions that the US, of course, is the first to ask. It's that famous line from, who was it? John Foster Dulles, where he said, "You're either with us or against us."
Yeah.
And, you know, the contrasting line to that is, "My enemy's enemy is my friend." And so you can understand, at least as a move, why some people have gone overboard perhaps in endorsing Russia or the Chinese modes of marked politic, right? Exertion of power as against the US's. Because
Mhm.
frankly, right now, these are kind of hypothetical. I mean, the only power that is exerting itself, certainly you can hardly deny its oversized role in the Israel Palestine genocide. Well, there's no genocide on the Israeli side, but the Palestinian genocide, how that unipolarity takes shape. So, everyone is, I think, desperate for someone from somewhere to rise up and say, not this.
Mhm.
So I'm less inclined to castigate people for making those kinds of,
Mhm.
taking sides, if you will, just
Yeah,
because
of
the
course.
stakes, again, are so weighted on one side and so fragile and kind of disanchored on the other.
Yeah. In that article, you also talk about, you write that there's no political immunity in bearing witness. That line kind of cuts against a powerful fantasy in academia and social media that is simply seeing, naming, or testifying is itself like a political act, right?
Right.
And how did this idea of moral witnessing become so central, and what does it obscure in your mind?
Right. That's a very provocative question, really, Sher. Witnessing takes so many different forms, right? I mean, if you were a witness in the International Court of Justice, that act of witnessing is much more substantive and significant than the kind of witnessing that happens when you are proposing to speak on behalf of XYZ others, right, who have suffered and gone. There's a kind of a, not only, it's the opposite of guilt by association, it's heroism by association. You associate yourself with a moment of heroism, a moment of suffering, a moment of victory or defeat, and that increases your cachet, if you will. Uh, that's what I mean by the kind of virtue signaling that comes from affiliations of that sort. It's an empty gesture, right? But even more than that, it's often a cynical gesture, and I don't see any real purpose behind it other than maybe an opportunistic one. It might help someone's career, especially if it takes academic form, or it might
Yeah.
it might give them a certain kind of prominence in what is, after all, a largely liberal framework of understanding in which we live, right? So radicalism is so marginalized that the most radical statements seem to be ones in which people are witnessing or testifying to someone else's
Mhm.
issue.
Yeah,
In other words, there's very
absolutely.
little risk in witnessing of that sort.
Yeah. You also insist that solidarity must be able to hold contradiction and complicity, not disavow them. I found that also very interesting because, why has contradiction become so difficult to bear? And what does it do to political thinking when innocence becomes a prerequisite?
Right. I would try to answer it in two different ways. One is that it's not innocence that is the prerequisite, it's really ignorance, right? There's a kind of what Gayatri Spivak a long time ago called sanctioned ignorance that allows people to assume a position of authority and disavow how they came to that authority or what that authority might actually lead to, right? So that is one problem in front of us when we're thinking about the issue that you raise. And let me see if I can remember the second thing I was going to say in response. I'm a little tired of just avowing complicity, right? I mean, we live under capitalism. We're all complicit in some way or the other. I'm not directly complicit in the kinds of things that, let's say, Trump is doing, or that the big corporations are doing, or that the military industrial complex is perpetrating. But, insofar as I have a 401k at my university, and unless I'm very vigilant and think about these things, my retirement could depend on things like munitions futures and so on and so forth, right? Or just even finance capital. So complicity is not something that we avert or somehow find a way out of. You have to assume that it's there. And then the question is, what sort of reparative work is possible? What kinds of commitments are necessitated by recognizing that, those large scale contradictions as well as small scale ones, which have to do with one's own class identity or which have to do with questions of privilege. Those are not going away, but you can't just wallow in the idea that this gives you no space from which to maneuver, no room for taking a stand on issues that have nothing perhaps to do with you yourself. Or in other words, let me give you an example. A lot of us write about novels, for instance, or films. In my case, there are many chapters in my book on Ray in which I'm talking about the way that a very privileged elite filmmaker like Satyajit Ray brings to the screen and brings to life the experience of extreme poverty in rural Bengal in ways that very few people have really managed to, let's say, imitate or really repeat. How? Is it his privilege that allowed him to make that kind of intervention? Or is it despite his privilege that he was able to make this intervention because he had a political vision, right? And the
Yeah.
political vision did not come from a place of identity or of any kind of sense that this was his experience, which it wasn't, but from a deep commitment to bringing to light experiences that are not your own, right? That are not of oneself, that need to be told if one is going to have a progressive vision at all and not reproduce the kind of bourgeois aesthetic world.
Yeah, absolutely. You describe the ethical subject, someone who performs the right stance, feels the right emotion, signals the right alignment. How do institutions, especially the university and its circuits of recognition, reward this subject? And what does refusal look like in that context?
Universities in the US are like any other corporation. They're going to reward people and reward ideas that don't rock the boat fundamentally. And they reward people who are, in a way, easily welcomed into that fold of privilege and of ideas that have ruled for decades, maybe much more than that. If you think about the gentleman scholar as a model of the university intellectual, that is not necessarily a model that works in the US. Although there were certainly gentlemen scholars in earlier generations, but certainly fewer and fewer now. But nonetheless, there's a sense that, we belong. It's a club. And in order to be part of the club, you have to say the right things and you have to do the right things, which is to say, you don't want to critique the institution itself in a way that, bothers anyone. For the most part, humanists are just disregarded, right? We just do our thing. But now Trump has made the university itself a target. And so what you say and how you say it and where you say it becomes very important. And sensitivities have also emerged as a result of the culture wars on both sides, the cancel culture on the one hand, and then the kind of right wing culture wars on the other, where people are trying to navigate, in between, sort of dance in between various sensitivities. That's what gets rewarded. To come out and say that, the university is a corrupt institution isn't necessarily the right thing to do either, because right now that is a sentiment that the right will run with, right? But so it's not necessarily the solution, but to recognize that the university is a corrupt institution and then try to see how that might change. This is, after all, a challenge of being in any kind of institutional setting, right?
Yeah. And in the context of like the digital sphere, we see a lot of younger organizers and intellectuals, me myself included, like we see outrage, various forms of statements being released, meme culture is another thing. Do you think this is like aestheticizing contradiction itself, turning it even into like turning even dissonance into sort of style,
Mhm.
expression
Right.
or something like that?
One's own actions and one's own words are not always able to capture their effects. There are always unintended consequences of anything one says or does, over which one has no control. And therefore, you have to, shy away a little bit from calling it culpable. I don't think it's so much culpability. I think people like you, younger people who are, you know, opening up a different world to audiences, perhaps even outside the academy, but also inside the academy. I decided a long time back that, in my classes, I might actually include a reading or two from the blogosphere, because that speaks to my students a lot more than, let's say, a kind of a classical author might. Or I try to compare what it is that is similar, what remains a kind of a shared theme in both arenas. So I wouldn't say that the digital sphere, so to speak, is just about aestheticizing dissonance. It's also about informing people in a way that was not possible outside of, much more circumscribed intellectual and institutional settings before. So that's the good side. On the other side, on the more negative side, yes, it's possible for anyone really to say anything, and there is no kind of necessary criterion of verifiability. So that, I think, is more the problem with the digital sphere, where misreadings, and I do believe that there are such things as misreadings or misunderstandings, can often be parlayed as correct positions or weighty judgments. So it's
Yeah.
always a it's always in the instance, right? In the actual concrete example that you have to figure out, is this productive? Is this getting the conversation further down the road, or is it stymieing it? Is it stumping us? I think that is a challenge that actually the digital sphere also invites people to take on. Not everything I read is convincing, and therefore I should be a skeptic. That kind of intellectual skepticism, which used to be a hallmark of knowledge production maybe 30, 40 years ago, that kind of
Critique all
intellectual
that
skepticism,
exists.
yeah, it has disappeared really in a way. Intellectual skepticism, not questioning everything, like vaccine denial or something like that, right?
Yeah, yeah,
But intellectual skepticism is what are the bases for a particular argument to hold. That kind of
yeah,
disappearance of skepticism intellectually is what has also led to, let's say, the giant size influence of Fox News. People believe what they hear.
yeah. You've also written about the missed encounter. a politics that doesn't resolve into harmony or recognition.